Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Symposium series on global food policy and food security here at the Center on Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University. I'm Roz Naylor, and I direct FSE, the Center on Food Security and the Environment, and I'm very happy to be moderating today. As many of you know, we have an audience of you here, and we also have a distance learning audience in Africa and South Asia. Many future leaders in the food security field will also be viewing this show tonight. So we're very honored to have an excellent lineup of speakers. So I'd like to give a brief introduction to the two speakers, and then we'll have them come up and talk, and then take your questions later on. I'm going to put my glasses on this time because usually I'm up here and I really can't see anything. So as I introduce, I'd first like to introduce Professor Per Pinstrup-Andersen, who's coming to us from Cornell University. We're very lucky that he actually got here. He got here at 6 a.m. Cornell time, 3 a.m. Stanford time after a very long flight on United, but we're happy to have you here. Professor Andersen is really among the top and most distinguished academicians in our field. He's probably the only economist, I think the only economist who's won the World Food Prize. He's currently at Cornell University, where he holds the Babcock Chair in Food Nutrition and Public Policy. He's also the Clark Professor in Entrepreneurship and an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen University, since he is native to Denmark. He says he's not going to answer any political questions on U.S. foreign policy, but I think we should really force him. He's really a U.S. citizen. He did his BS at the Royal Agricultural University in Denmark, but his MS and PhD at Oklahoma State, and has had a long career here in the U.S. So I think anything is fair game for him tonight. But Professor Andersen has had just an unbelievably rich career. I mean, one of the most distinguished careers in our field. He was 10 years as the Director General of IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and did a stellar job there. Many people who have worked there were spent 5 years just hearing how sad everyone that he had left, and so everybody really honored and really appreciated his time at IFPRI. I think he really contributed a lot in that role. He also, for 6 years, was the chair of the Science Council at the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the CGAR system, and was a fellow and past president of the American Agricultural Economics Association. So he's had, quite a distinguished career in addition to being at CIAT, which is another of the international agricultural research institutions, and some other professorships along the way. As I said, he's gained a number of awards, was the winner of the World Food Prize, which is just really the ultimate award in our field in 2001, has won many teaching awards, and I think it'll be a real pleasure to listen to him tonight. His publication record goes on, just a mile wide and 10 miles deep. He's just a very prolific writer, and his writing is very fun. He did write a paper for this session tonight, and it's a wonderful paper to read. I would encourage you all to take a look at it. Some of his more recent books, I'll just hold up one that I have been using in my own research, which is on the African food systems and its interaction with human health and nutrition. I think he's gained a real reputation in linking health and food and agriculture in ways that most scholars have not achieved in the past, and that's why we're particularly happy to have him here tonight. So, Per, welcome. And before you stand up, I'm just going to introduce Eran Bendavid quickly so that I can get the introductions out of the way. Eran Bendavid is an assistant professor here at Stanford in the medical school, has expertise and a record in medicine and infectious disease, and also in policy. He is also a fellow at the Center for Health Policy Research here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. In 1996, he earned his degree from Dartmouth in the unusual combination of chemistry and philosophy, of which he was summa cum laude. In 2001, got his MD from Harvard, and in 2009, an MS at Stanford Health Services, and so again, gaining that distinction in both medicine and public policy. He's been the winner of many awards, of which One is the Remington Award for Clinical Work in Infectious Diseases in 2006, and the Rosencrantz Prize for Healthcare Research in Developing Countries, which is a real honor here at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Again, he also has very wide publication record. That includes work on effective strategies for monitoring HIV and HIV treatment, abortion in Africa. There's all sorts of really interesting and very important topics on his resume as well. I'm very lucky personally to have him as a colleague on a new project that we're doing in Western Kenya on the interaction of water, health, and food, and it's just been a real pleasure to work with him. So I think we have two excellent people tonight, and I will turn the floor over to the two of you, and we look forward to having a good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. It's wonderful to be back at Stanford University. I haven't been here for several years. It's always great to be back. It's particularly great to see my mentor and friend, Wally Falcon, in his home environment. I want to start by sharing some good news and some bad news with you. And let me start with the good news. The good news is that according to the British Pork Producer Association, we're going to have a major bacon shortage next year. That is very good for nutrition. The bad news is that the New England Institute of Complex Systems, I believe it's called, has been very good at predicting food riots and food crises. And they have informed us that sometime during the first half of next year, we're going to have a bigger food riot than we ever had. And it's caused by lack of food, as you can see on this slide. That's, of course, not to be believed, but that is what they say. Now, you may think that this is the United States fiscal deficit, but it really isn't. This is the number of pounds of food that is lost every year in the worldwide food systems. Theoretically, that can feed something roughly to half of the current world population. So you can consider that a bad news, or you can consider that an opportunity, or you can consider that as pure fiction. The fact remains, however, that we are losing a tremendous amount of food between the farmer and the consumer. Whether it's 30% or 20%, who knows for sure. This number that I have up on the screen is obviously correct because it came from an FAO commissioned study, and FAO has blessed it as being the number of the day. Actually, I developed the number based on, they presented it in tons, but it looks a lot better when you do it in pounds. So why am I giving you this, all this unscientific evidence at a supposedly scientific seminar? The reason is I want to make sure that I get the point across that if we are really interested in understanding how we can change the food system for the benefit of health and nutrition, we got to look at the big things, not the little things. Now, that's obvious. However, all of the evaluations, with the exception maybe of one or two, of how the food system has affected health and nutrition, have been based on small-scale projects, home garden projects, intervention projects of various kinds. Why? Because the evaluation methods used were coming from the health sciences. And the health sciences want double-blind, controlled, randomized experimental design. And if we can't do that, the evidence is not credible. We somehow got to move away from that and start looking at different methodologies so that we know, for example, what is the health effect of the new farm bill as opposed to the old farm bill. the new farm bill that doesn't exist yet, but presumably will be agreed upon at some future point in time. There are some changes in that. Studies were done of one of the older farm bills that showed that there was no real health effect. If you took all of the components of the farm bill, it didn't really change health very much. If anything, the farm bill probably improved health. There have been a set of other studies done that, no, that's definitely not so. But except for those studies, very few, if any, studies have really looked at those big issues. So somehow we've got to get beyond that and really look at, and yes, we may have to deal with associations instead of causality. As an economist, I can easily live with that. But as an epidemiologist, it may be more difficult. So we got to somehow move beyond only looking at those little experiments where we can have a control group. So why are we doing this? Well, it's very complex. This is a simplified version of a conceptual framework that one of my PhD students developed about a year and a half ago. I don't expect you to read any of this. I just want to get the point across that this is really complicated. Just about anything we do in an economy that somehow affects poor people will affect their health and nutrition. So how do we straighten out all of these relationships? Well, I'm suggesting that we first look at some of the big drivers of the food system, some of the really important drivers. And then we speculate and we use whatever evidence we can find. No, they are not double-blind, randomized, experimental design evidence. Whatever evidence we have on any of these steps, try to do the best we can in finding out how health and nutrition will be affected if certain changes were made in the food system. So what I want to do first is to go through some of those major drivers. Then I want to come back and talk about, in more specific terms, what are the pathways? How do we get from the food system to human health and nutrition? What are some of the many pathways? Yes, for sure, the food system produces food, therefore if you don't eat food, you don't survive, so therefore there's a pathway. Absolutely correct. But there are many other pathways that we need to fully understand. So let me talk, and then I'll end the discussion by talking about the policies. What do I think the government can do in a particular developing country? And yes, Wally, I am focusing this on Africa, but much of what I'm going to say is relevant not only for Africa, but also for other developing countries, and some of it is actually relevant for the United States and Denmark as well. Food price changes. We had many seminars, many papers on the food price volatility since 2007, and obviously I can't spend a lot of time on that. So let me just make a few points. First, most of the small farmers in developing countries, particularly in Africa, are net buyers of food. Therefore, when the food price goes up, they will be negatively affected, at least in the short run. This, I think, is something we have lots of evidence to back that up. Secondly, when net food buyers are affected by higher food prices, two things tend to happen. One, they move towards less expensive calories, and two, they cut back on the total amount that they eat, total amount of calories. What that does, among other things, it creates or it enhances the micronutrient deficiency. We're going to consume more of the kind of thing that may not have a lot of micronutrients in it because it tends to be a little more expensive. So those two things, and this again, there's quite a bit of evidence coming in now that is how households will respond to the price change. What we know very little about, how do they respond when prices then go down again? Well, is it really reversible? Is it symmetric? We don't know much about the price fluctuations and how they affect nutrition. We know a lot about how an increase in price affect fluctuation. Much of the literature that we have today actually confuses the two. You will have the title of an article that says, here's how I think price fluctuation affects, food price fluctuations affect poor people, and the whole article is about price increase. So we need to somehow straighten that one out. There are much more that can be said about the price volatility, but the main health-related issue, it seems to me, is what I have just said. Now, if the consequence is to cut back on calories, of course, it's not necessarily negative. It depends on whether the particular person that we're talking about is overweight or not. So it could have a positive nutrition effect, which brings out the other point, which we need to do a lot more work on. Namely, we need a clear specification of the problem. Malnutrition is a lot of different things. So we need to understand what kind of malnutrition are we really talking about before we can begin to design policies. Economic growth, urbanization, and globalization, we get rid of poverty and we thereby got rid of malnutrition. No, we didn't. Poverty is a critical factor in hunger and malnutrition, but alleviating poverty does not by itself eliminate the malnutrition problem. There's a lot. It took me quite some time, some years ago, to accept the fact that if you got rid of poverty, you still had some problems, nutrition problems to deal with, other than obesity and chronic diseases, of course, talking about undernutrition. But the fact is that poverty is it's necessary but not sufficient for alleviating undernutrition. A couple of things happen when you have economic growth, urbanization, and globalization. One is the diet transition. I'm going to show a couple of slides a little later on diet transition. There's a tremendous diet transition taking place in the rapidly growing lower middle income and middle income countries, including some of the African countries as well. Another thing that tends to take place is as the countries open up their borders, let's call it globalization or trade liberalization, a lot of energy-dense food will flow in. Processed food flows in from the outside. And by energy-dense, I'm talking about food with high content of refined sugar and sweetener and high content of fat. That contributes to the overweight, obesity, and chronic disease problem in the countries that open up their market. One other thing I want to say about this is that as urbanization takes on, the supply chain becomes longer. That opens up opportunities for doing something about health and nutrition beyond the farm. You now suddenly have a supply chain that includes storage and transportation and processing and maybe more processing and exchange, buying and selling in a number of different places. Suddenly you have a whole bunch of places where things can go wrong or where things can be really good, be improved. Microtoxins, for example, in storage and in transportation is just one of many health issues that we need to take account of in this post-harvest supply chain. So we really have to be careful that we understand how long is that supply chain and can we turn that into a nutrition value chain. Dr. Hawks and others have written quite a bit about that. So those are some of the issues that are closely related to economic growth, urbanization, and globalization. Research and technological change. Diet diversity is incredibly important for good nutrition. Diet diversity, yes. Biofortification, meaning putting micronutrients into the seed so that the plant will produce more micronutrients in the food that we eat is wonderful. It's a great effort. But the ultimate goal must be diet diversification. If our research priorities continue to focus on single commodities produced in monocropping systems, we are likely to continue to have a great deal of micronutrient deficiency. Again, it took a little convincing and a lot of reading and a lot of talking before I realized that we really need to have a portfolio of agricultural research in the sense of looking at a number of different commodities and not just the major food staples. The Green Revolution was wonderful. It was the best development project that ever happened as far as I'm concerned. But we now need to move on and put much more effort on pulses, on grain legumes, if you like, on fruits and vegetables, on a portfolio of commodities, because production diversity is closely linked to consumption diversity. Now you can argue that's a tautology because we presumably eat what we produce, but if you look at a low-income farm, say in Africa, and it has a broad production diversity, it is much more likely to have a broad consumption diversity, even though it buys and sells. It doesn't just eat what it produces itself. So there is a close link between what we really need from a nutrition and health perspective, namely diet diversity and production diversity. And as you all know, the Green Revolution was extremely effective in increasing productivity in rice and maize, rice and wheat, and subsequently in maize as well, or corn if you like, and some other commodities as well. It reduced the unit cost of production in rice and wheat by 30 to 40%. That reduced the prices consumers paid for those commodities, and it increased the incomes of farmers. But at the same time, the relative prices of, and for that matter, the real prices of pulses, grain legumes, particularly in South Asia, went up quite a bit. So there was a huge change in the diet at roughly the same time as there was a very large increase in iron deficiency anemia. Now, in my simple-minded view, there had to be a causal link between the two, so I convinced one of the PhD students I supervised to look at this for India. It turned out that, in fact, it was a different relationship than what I expected, and I'm bringing this up now because it shows a bit about the complexity. The Green Revolution decreased the total intake of iron in the sample population that we looked at. It decreased the total intake of iron, which is exactly what I expected. So I said, see, oops, I shouldn't do that. See what I told you. And then she said, oh, wait a minute, I'm a nutritionist. I'm going to look at absorbable iron. And it turns out that pulses, grain legumes, have a lot of inhibitors, and this is a little above my pay grade. I'm not a nutritionist. But anyway, she showed that the intake of absorbable iron actually went up because of the Green Revolution. So you have to be careful with these kinds of relationships, but the fact remains that we need a diversified diet. Biofuel and competition for resources, all I want to say there is that biofuel can increase the income of small farmers, which can have a positive effect on health and nutrition, but it also takes land away from the production of food. When the Brazilian president was traveling, the past president, President Lula, was traveling around Africa telling them to plant sugarcane for biofuel instead of corn for consumption, I was really concerned. Not that I could do anything about it, but I thought it was probably the wrong advice he was giving those small farmers or the governments. I still think it's the wrong advice, but anyway, the point here is that his argument was you can make more money by doing that, and then you can use that money to buy more food. And I used to think that way until I realized that that additional money might not be available to the people who produce the biofuel, and particularly if they had to import the food. The foreign exchange might be used for something else. So there is a serious issue here of competition for resources, which brings me to my pet topic, and that's land grabbing. I've been involved in some shouting matches with some organizations around the world about land grabbing. I happen to think it's a pretty bad thing. And the reason I think so is I'm looking at the evidence. There isn't a whole lot of evidence, or there wasn't a whole lot of evidence up until a couple of years ago. But now we're beginning to get evidence back that shows that land grabbing is replacing small farmers in huge areas of sub-Saharan Africa. It's pushing the farmers out. It's not re-employing the farmers. what's being produced, which is frequently jatropha for biofuel, or it could be food commodities, is exported out of the country with no payment to the government. These corporations that come in, the transnational corporations that come in from the outside, sometimes they're agents of governments like China and India, pay very little for the land. They rent it for 99 years for maybe $1 a year. What they pay the government under the table, nobody knows. That's for good reasons kept confidential, but there's probably quite a bit of that. The people in the local areas frequently don't know what's happening to them until the bulldozers come in and tell them if they haven't left in 10 minutes, they're going to be in trouble, whatever. Now, having shared my bias with you, and I think it is evidence-based actually, we've got some good evidence now. If the definition of your problem, of our problem, is that we're confronting a global food shortage, then land grabbing is probably not a bad thing. Because although many of these projects are failing because they have no idea what they're doing, these are capital funds. And at best they have one agronomist on the team, but usually the investment people think they can handle that. I mean, after all, you just get a jatropha something and you stick it in the ground. And of course they know that jatropha trees don't need water or nutrients. They can grow without those two things. Well, some of us know that's not likely to happen. So many of them are failing. Most recently a big capital fund called Sun Biofuel. It's headquartered in the UK. Got access to 10,000 hectares in Tanzania. They managed to plant 2,000 hectares with jatropha trees. I think most of them died. Then they went bankrupt. Now here's the problem. So you've got this 10,000 hectares sitting there. The farmers can't get back to their land because it's a 99-year lease. And let me not go any further on that. But, so coming back to what's the goal? If the goal is we're running short at the global level on food, yeah, let's get some capital-intensive equipment. Let's get lots of tractors in there, and let's forget about small farmers who will just do this the Kansas wheat production way. If, on the other hand, what we're concerned about is food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition, we should take a totally different approach. We should invest in rural infrastructure. We should invest in whatever is holding back the small farmers who are currently on the land. And unfortunately, the news media doesn't necessarily know the difference. So the headlines frequently are, "We're running out of food." You just saw the empty shelves up there. That is much more newsworthy than to saying, look, we got a lot of people who don't have enough to eat. Yeah, we know that. You told us that yesterday and the day before. That's no longer news. But guess what? Now we're running out of food. So sometimes the news media is not helping. Climate change, of course, is a big joker in all of that. Now, the results from the models that I've seen show that at the global level, there isn't going to be that much difference in the production. Climate change is not going to have much of an effect on global production. Whether that's true or not, I can't tell. I can just look at what comes out of the models. But the spatial distribution, of course, is huge. And it's directly correlated with the distance from equator. So therefore, where most of the poor people are, there's going to be tremendous pressure, downward pressure on yields unless something is done. By 2050, we will be probably 9 billion people, according to the UN. Maybe by the end of the century, we will add another couple of billion, and then it may stabilize somewhere around, who knows, 12 billion maybe. By that time, I can make all kinds of predictions for that time because I won't be around. But certainly by 2050. I probably won't be around for 2050 either, but never mind. By 2050, we can easily feed 9 billion people. The productive capacity of this earth is sufficient to do that. The real problem is, are we going to do it sustainably, or are we going to continue to tear up the natural resources by doing that? So that's where policy comes in. But in terms of running short on food, and I'm one of the few economists who thinks that from now on, the long-term trend of food prices at the global level, a long-term trend is going to be downward. Not much, but some. We have seen the adjustment that we needed at the end of the last century. We've gotten the adjustment. It's been very bumpy. We're going to continue to see huge fluctuations in food prices, but I don't believe the long-term trend is going to be up. I said I was going to come back and say a few words about the diet transition. So this is an illustration of the diet transition worldwide. I'm using data for China because I think they represent exactly what is likely to happen. If you look at grains all the way to the left, you see there's a decrease in stable food consumption, whether it's grain or fresh vegetables. There's a dramatic increase in the consumption of edible oils, dramatic increase in meat consumption, egg and aquatic products. Now, what does that do to the diet and to our health? Well, of course, it depends on where you are when this dramatic change takes place. But if that change continues, then of course you are going to end up, in this case the Chinese, but in fact it's probably representative of the rest of the world as well, to more or less, to a certain extent anyway. We are all going to end up with chronic diseases, because that's exactly what this picture is painting. I have a similar one for the, this is for the rural households, I have a similar one for the urban households, but it's basically the same trend. So let me not spend more time on that in the paper, and I understand the paper will be available at some point if it isn't already. So let me now talk about each of these pathways very quickly. First, talking about nutrients, energy and nutrient balance, resulting, of course, as you know, in growth retardation among children, in reduced disease resistance, in anemia, blindness caused by vitamin A deficiency, anemia caused by iron deficiency, chronic diseases, diabetes, and other non-communicable diseases. The paper goes into considerable detail about the prevalence of nutrition and so on. I'll probably skip that, except to say that roughly 1 in 7 of the world's population is now short on calories and protein. About 1 in 4 is short of some micronutrients. The prevalence of the bad side of the prevalence is worse for Africa, where probably 1 in 3 to 1 in 4, depending on whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or Africa, is short of calories and protein. But the prevalence of overweight, obesity, and chronic diseases is going up, and you now have a very high rate of mortality caused by chronic diseases, even in developing countries. In high-income developing countries, let's say middle-income developing countries, those are at the high end but still developing, it is low-income people who suffer most from overweight and obesity, whereas in the poorest countries, it's the high-income people that suffer mostly from overweight and obesity. So there's a switch somewhere in there, where as the country becomes richer, the prevalence of overweight obesity tends to shift from the small portion of high-income people to the large portion of low-income people, and we see this worldwide. There's a lot more about nutrition in the paper, but let me say just a couple of other things. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to keep nutrition in mind when we talk about health. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the deaths are related to malnutrition in developing countries, and that's what this shows. 1/3, more than 1/3. There are other estimates that show a little more than half. Let me just very quickly run through the generic pathway now with respect to nutrition. Available food obviously have to be available, and we can apply this same generic pathway, if you like, to water, good sanitation, and healthcare, because all of these, of course, work together to create the kind of health situation we're in. Food may be available, but the prices may be such that households can't afford them. So money and time constraints extremely important. Study after study shows that time constraints in low-income households of developing country women. Time constraints for women in those households are frequently as important or more important than income constraints for good health and nutrition. And this is something that I think the evidence is very, very clear based on the field studies. So on the assumption that the prices and the money and time constraints are conducive to getting access to the available food, we then say that the household is food secure. So that's food security, that's part of the name of the center. Access to food means that the household is food secure. Again, I put on clean water, good sanitation, healthcare as well, and of course it's the same general argument. So if a household is food secure, there's no problem. Everybody's well fed, everybody's happy, everybody smiles. No. Because there is a big behavioral issue that determines whether that access is actually being exploited. And if it is exploited, how is it being allocated within the household? So a household may be food secure, but every member in the household may be malnourished. That is not an oxymoron. Some of the adults may be overweight, some of the kids may be underweight, for example. Or all the kids may be underweight, and all the adults may be overweight. They may all suffer from micronutrient deficiency. I talk about a triple burden of malnutrition. It's lack of calories and protein, burden number 1, lack of micronutrients, burden number 2, overweight, obesity, chronic diseases, burden number 3. So the behavioral aspect, and we tend to ignore that because, after all, we know what's good for the intended beneficiaries, and they will certainly know that too, so they'll do exactly what you think they will do. No, of course they don't. They have a set of agendas that they are dealing with. So we have to understand the behavior. And I had lunch with Wally and colleagues and Russ and Eran. And I say, so I said to Wally, what do you think of the, psychologists and the neuroscience field arguing that we are not making rational decisions, that we really don't make decisions in the behavior of expected outcome. Now, for those of you who are not economists, I should explain that the whole economics argument is built on people being rational. We are all kind of utilitarians. I mean, we make decisions on the basis of expected outcome. And if we don't do this anymore, and all of the policy recommendations I'm going to come to are based on that same thing. Now, if people are not rational, they don't make decisions on the basis of expected outcome, then we should probably all go and have a glass of wine, because what I'm going to say may not make a whole lot of sense. And Wally, do you want to tell me what your answer was when I asked what you thought of that? Proceed. Proceed, okay. Okay, let's just say that Wally wasn't enthusiastically supporting the idea that maybe we're not quite as rational as we think we are. I'm going to come back to that, but I think this is really important, because what that literature is saying, among other things, is that yes, there is some rationality if we define it as making decisions on the basis of expected outcome. But a lot of what we make decisions on is the environment. So why is that important for food policy? It's important because we need to know if we need to change the environment or we need to try to improve the knowledge and the information available to the decision maker. And if we don't know where the gap is, where the constraint is, we may well be dishing out a lot of nutrition education programs, for example, that will have absolutely no effect whatsoever. Is that hypothetical? No. A lot of the nutrition education that's been going on, whether in Africa or elsewhere, has had absolutely no effect. Now, is that because we don't really understand what drives the decision-making process, or because we don't understand the other constraints? I have been saying it's because we don't take into account the constraints. I'm going to tell Eran that he has to feed his children this wonderful diversified diet, forgetting that Eran doesn't have any money. Or he has to work 20 hours a day. He doesn't have time to do whatever needs to be done to make sure the kids are well fed. So I've been arguing that if we just focus on the most limiting constraint, we're going to be successful. But that means we have to understand what they are. But now these psychologists are telling us there's more to it than that. Even if you know what the constraints are, and you're going to tell somebody to do something different, that somebody may not do it because of lack of because the expected outcome may not drive the decision. So anyway, enough on that. And that, of course, eventually, hopefully, ends in some kind of a health and nutrition situation. So that's a very generic pathway. Obviously, it has to be tailored to each case. I'm not going to go through this. This is beginning to sound like the one I showed you. It looked like the one I showed you at the beginning. I just want to make one point, which I think I already made. All of this is really related to the behavioral aspects, because it has to do with how the food, whether the food security is utilized, whether the household actually acquires the food that the household could acquire. And that is then a behavioral aspect, and the allocation as well. So all of these things, and many of these things, are gender specific. Look, for example, at inter-household income and budget control, women's time allocation and constraints, preferences by individuals, breastfeeding practices. We really have to understand gender specificity, these gender-specific issues. That's all I'm going to say about that. Is in the paper with a lot more explanation. I want to go to the next point on the on this graph, and that's food safety. Obviously, food safety, water safety, sanitation, hygiene, they all have to come together. We can have wonderful food safety, but if the water is unsafe or if the sanitation is poor, it may not have much positive effect on health. The contamination I'm showing, the microbial contamination, of course, falls under zoonotic pathogens, so there isn't a complete exclusivity among these various graphs. Again, I want to point you to what I said before about behavior and environment. We need to understand which of these two we need to focus on if we're going to make a difference from the perspective of government policy. Waterborne diseases, the food system has a lot to do with that. Poorly managed, poor water management systems, irrigation systems and so on can contribute to more waterborne diseases of various kinds. More than half of all the illnesses that we suffer from originated in animals. Now, some of those are down here in the microbial component. But if you take all of the zoonotic disease, zoonotic, of course, means transfer from animals to humans or from humans to animals. I'm only going to talk about the animal to human part, but there is another direction of that as well. So we have a whole string of zoonotic diseases that affect people. We don't do much about them. If a chicken gets chicken flu or avian flu, as I think we call them, we just kill the chicken, right? If there are chickens around, we kill them too, right? Very scientific approach to things. We don't really look at the interaction. Are there other ways of doing this? Why couldn't we breed a resistant chicken? A chicken that's resistant to avian flu, for example. How about the mad cow disease? How about all of these other zoonotic diseases that we take a sledgehammer to instead of the brain? We're not really looking at sustainable solutions to these interactions, in my humble opinion. HIV/AIDS, extremely important in agricultural production. That causality runs right to left in most cases, in the sense that it reduces productivity, and a number of policy interventions, and I'll come to those in a minute, that need to be applied. Drugs and medicinal plants include a lot of sins, and some that are not so sinful. One is, of course, that the food system can produce raw materials for drugs that are needed in the pharmaceutical industry or needed to cure people. Food system can also produce drugs that are illicit, but they may make small farmers better off, so they could have a positive nutrition effect where they're being produced and a negative health effect where they're being used. And then we got the use of drugs in the production process, not to cure animals, but to make them grow faster. We have growth hormones, we have antibiotics being used, and a number of drugs like that as well. Production processing systems, I want to spend a little more time on that, and I try to summarize that here in very generic manner. Energy-dense food, whether they're produced by farmers or by the processing industry, tend to contribute to the risk of diabetes. Red and processed meat tend to contribute to cancer of various kinds, colon cancer being one. Now, do I really believe that? Yeah, because there are so many studies now that show that. And then we can, the food system can contaminate the food. Melamine in milk in China, as I'm sure you all remember, caused widespread illness and a few deaths. And then I stumbled over a very interesting study. I actually didn't stumble over it, it kind of came to me. There's only the one study. They looked at the content of chicken feather meal. Chicken feather meal, as the term implies, is meal made from chicken feather, and it is fed to animals. So a group of researchers at Johns Hopkins University decided they were going to check to see if there were some antibiotics. I think they were looking for antibiotics, or maybe they're looking for antibiotic resistance or something in them. And then they got going and they said, well, let's see what else is in this. And here's what they found. Arsenic, caffeine, the active ingredient in Tylenol, the active ingredient in Prozac, the active ingredient in Benadryl. And of course, they found their antibiotics and they found resistant bacteria. That's one study. We have no idea as to whether this stuff is available in the meat of the chicken, but we do know that that meal is being fed to animals, and presumably it ends up on the land somehow as manure or in some other way. But we don't know whether it really enters the food system in the consumption. So you could ask, why hasn't that study been replicated? Well, for one thing, it's a new study. Maybe it will be replicated. But the other question I have is, why isn't somebody doing a study of the chicken meat? I would like to know how much arsenic in the chicken is in the chicken I'm going to eat tomorrow. But apparently nobody is doing that study. And you can kind of wonder about why those studies are not being done, and I don't have a good answer. I don't believe in conspiracy theories. If I did, I would say it's because the feed producers, the chicken feed producers, are paying the researchers off for not doing it. I don't believe in that kind of thing. I think there are enough independent researchers. By the way, I should tell you how this came about. After the researchers found this stuff, they went back to try to find the source, and the source in almost all cases was the feed. What happens is poultry farmers enter into contracts, and those contracts include delivery of feed. They don't know what's in that feed. The feed comes into them in probably multicultural bags or whatever, and they feed that to the chickens. Some of that keeps the chickens awake longer so they can eat more so they can grow faster. Others of these things keep the chickens calm so they don't waste too much energy running around. And arsenic, for example, keeps them healthy. Apparently a little bit of arsenic is a good thing. I'm not going to try it, but at least it seems to work in animals. They have a shorter lifespan too. Occupational hazard. FAO is making a big deal of occupational hazards in agriculture primarily. Well, in the food system as a whole, meat packing plants and so on. There's quite a bit going on there. Toxins and allergens, I'm talking about some. I don't think I talked about pesticides in the food systems. I should probably mention that as well. That it is very clear that if you can avoid using certain pesticides, for example in organic production systems, those pesticides will not show up as residues in your food. That goes without saying. If the organic production system doesn't use antibiotics in the production system, then the antibiotics won't show up in the food, and so on. So that is very clear, and everybody seemed to agree on that. There have been a number of studies, including a recent study done by Stanford University that shows that organically produced food contained much less of those kinds of things. Now, since I'm talking about organic food, let me also mention a controversial issue, namely, is organic food more nutritious than food that's grown in a more traditional manner? And here there's a wild disagreement. The Stanford study, as I read it, found that, yeah, there might be some, but not really significant difference in the nutritional value of organic food they looked at and food produced in a more traditional way. Whereas other studies have been very clear saying there is no nutrition difference, and yet other studies have said there is a nutrition difference, and here it is, looking at specific nutrients. So the jury is still out on that one. And my guess is it depends on what you focus on. If you focus on a particular nutrient, in some cases you may find a difference, in other cases you may not. But again, it's above my pay grade. I'm just reading what comes out from the literature. But there certainly isn't an agreement on that. However, there was a very violent reaction to the Stanford study, as some of you probably know, by the organic group, by the people who are supporting organically produced food. And I kind of got a kick out of that. It was almost like you stepped on holy ground here that you were not supposed to. And I thought the reaction was so violent, I didn't really understand why they, a newspaper as neutral and as how do I put this, as good as New York Times actually published a few pieces that really came after the Stanford study, which I thought was very inappropriate. But it does point out that some of these things are extremely sensitive, just like the GMOs. I mean, you're either for it or against it or nobody cares. It's the same with some of the organic food. Why can't we just kind of look at this objectively or scientifically? And maybe we can, some of us. Anyway, let me now move to the policy interventions. And I want to talk about the policy interventions in an organized along the supply chain, or as I call it here, the food value chain. Because as the value chain or the supply chain becomes longer, agricultural policies for improving nutrition become less important, relatively speaking. Because you now have as you have a longer supply chain, there's so much going on in there, as I mentioned earlier, that you can really change for the benefit of health and nutrition. So let me go through what policy recommendations I would have. And these are, of course, to some extent generic, because we can't sit here in Palo Alto, or for that matter anywhere else, and design policies for a particular country or a particular community. But so look at that more as a menu of areas where policy interventions might be useful for improving health. And this is the food value chain that I'm going to use. In the paper, I have quite a bit of discussion about what the food system is and all of that, which I haven't had time to talk about here. So let's begin with the top one, this one, natural resources and inputs. What are some of the areas that governments might want to look at in order to improve health and nutrition? Improve water management systems to avoid waterborne diseases. Yes, of course. We need to understand how the irrigation systems may affect the prevalence of malaria, for example, and a number of other waterborne diseases. And it may not require a great deal of change in the irrigation system, but if we don't keep it in mind as we design the system, it may do tremendous damage. Drinking water needs to be improved. We need to improve reduce the risk of infectious diseases. Add micronutrients to soil to reduce micronutrient deficiencies in humans. Again, it took me a while for me to really understand that if you put zinc and iron into fertilizers and you apply that fertilizer in a zinc and iron deficient soil, the plants would actually produce something you can eat that's higher in zinc and iron. But it is the case. There have been a number of studies showing that in fact that is one way of helping to reduce micronutrient deficiency. But of course, if the soils are not deficient in those micronutrients, it won't do you any good. And then on the zoonotic disease side, the interaction with wildlife to reduce risk of zoonotic diseases. And one of the intriguing questions here is, and again, there's no agreement on that in the literature, would the risk of zoonotic disease go up or down as you increase the concentration of farm animals? So if you've got one pig tied up in the backyard at some Chinese household, and you got 50,000 pigs somewhere else in one location, where is the risk of zoonotic diseases higher? And what about the risk of food safety, which of course can be part of the zoonotic diseases? The way I read the literature, I think we're better off with a high concentration, because there's much more control. There's much more on the line here. The producer of the 50,000 pigs is going to be extremely careful. He's not going to let any of us in there because we might carry some germs that the pigs would be infected by. He's going to do all kinds of things to avoid any kind of illness, whether it's illness in the pigs themselves or illness transferred to humans. On the other hand, if it does affect the unit with 50,000 pigs, it may have a much bigger impact than if that one pig that was tied up in the backyard in a Chinese household is affected. So you've got trade-offs. But the point here is that there are, if we go back to sub-Saharan Africa, there are so many different ways of interacting with both wildlife and domesticated animals that could be changed to reduce the zoonotic diseases. When I grew up, and it says a little bit about my age, but I suspect you already know roughly what that is. And if you don't, it doesn't matter. When I grew up, there were still households in Denmark, farming households, that had their animals in one end of the house and they lived in the other. We had a farm worker on the farm where I grew up, whose room was right next to the horses. Now, these kinds of things don't happen in Denmark anymore, but a lot of this is still happening in many other countries. So there are a number of things that can be done to reduce the risk of zoonotic diseases. Primary production, farming if you like. I already mentioned that I think we need to take a close look at our agricultural research priorities and prioritize a larger, wider portfolio of crops and production systems. Yes, the Green Revolution was wonderful, but we now need to move on to make sure we have a more diverse production system, and we can do that through research, we can do it through policy, change in price policies, for example. Biofortification offers tremendous opportunities right now. It is not widely available. It's available in sweet potatoes in parts of Africa. There are a couple of commodities that have been released for production in China. I think a couple of grain legumes. But most of the biofortification is still in the research phase. But it offers, I think, tremendous possibility. It's done mostly within the CGIAR, but some of the private corporations are doing some as well. And as I said before, biofortification is entering the micronutrients in the seed, as opposed to industrial fortification, where you enter the what you want to add after production. So the breakfast cereals you may have had this morning was probably fortified by all kinds of things, and that was added after production. That doesn't work too well in rural areas or developing countries, say of Africa, where the rural infrastructure is so poor, where most of what's being consumed is produced locally or on the farm itself. It doesn't pass through a processing link, and therefore it can't be industrialized. It can't be fortified industrialized. Gender-specific productivity in activities traditionally undertaken by women. As I mentioned earlier, time and time again, we see studies that say the main limiting factor is the time of women. Now, you can argue that's unethical and that's all kinds of things, but the fact remains that women are still responsible for virtually everything they did before, and then when new projects or new ideas come in, they may put more labor demand on women. Because after all, a wonderful thing to do is to give women more employment opportunities. Yes, absolutely. But only if you increase the productivity of what she was doing before. Or you pass that on to somebody else. God forbid, maybe the man. You can't just keep adding it. Let me give you just one anecdote. And ever since Reagan was president, I've realized anecdotes are good. So let me give you just one anecdote. One of my PhD students who did his research in Bolivia spent about a year down there, and he came back and he said, look, here's the normal day for a woman in the uplands of Bolivia. She gets up very, very early in the morning. She does a lot of stuff around the house. She then including cooking and whatnot, she then takes the goats and the sheep out on the common grazing area, and there isn't much grass out there, so they roam around a lot, and she has to move with them. She would usually have a child on her back and maybe one or two on the side. She doesn't even have time to breastfeed, because by the time she gets ready for that, the goats are over there. Some of them are over there. She doesn't have time to breastfeed. They also produce potatoes in that region, so she brings a raw potato and she sticks that raw potato over to the 6-month-old in the back. Now imagine what kind of nutrition that is. Then she comes home with the goats and sheep and she does all of the stuff around the house, and then, of course, there's no time to do exactly what he was asking her to do, namely to change the diet of the children, because that took time. She didn't have it. She just didn't have it. Don't ask me what the men did. I don't know. We didn't. He didn't include that. But presumably they were trading or they were working off the farm. I'm sure they weren't lazy. I'm sure they were doing something very important. But it was probably off the farm. So the gender specificity in productivity, in time allocation, in decision-making power, extremely, extremely important. And that goes to the next one, strengthening gender equality in production decisions. And I already talked about interaction between humans and animals to reduce the risk of zoonotic diseases. That will be valid here as well. Labor-saving technology and production practices in households with HIV/AIDS. I get myself into all kinds of trouble with my economics colleagues because I say, no, you cannot suggest labor-saving technology because you need labor-using technology, because there's a lot of labor out there, underutilized or maybe unemployed. And I think we have to make a difference between communities where HIV/AIDS and TB and other illnesses have reduced the productivity to a level where they really do need labor-saving technology. And that's the point I'm making. Sanitary conditions in the production process. Again, it links up with health and nutrition. We need improved storage and transportation facilities to reduce the risk of mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are widespread. They are deadly. Aflatoxin, for example, but there are other mycotoxins. The quality deteriorates in storage and transportation. And that means infrastructure development. And if I had a pile of money, I have to stop doing this. If I had a pile of money that I could use to help African countries improve the rural development and food security, I would invest it in infrastructure. I think that is the binding constraint. Generically speaking, it varies by community, from one community to the other. But generically speaking, I think lack of infrastructure, lack of roads, lack of appropriate institutions, farmer associations, irrigation canals, on and on and on. That's where the investment is needed. We can produce research results that would help farmers double their yields. In fact, farmers can double their yields now with the existing technology. That has been shown in project after project. The 1 acre farm, the 1 acre fund, for example, has shown that. The Sasakawa project has shown that. Number of small projects have shown they can go in, work with farmers, and double or triple yields. Everything is beautiful until the project leaves. Farmer goes right back to where he was. Why? Because the external constraints were not removed. So that's where we need to work, in my humble opinion. And that's not just for health improvement. I talked about industrial fortification, labeling and regulation of food processing with respect to content and processes. The question is, how far do you want to go down the line for processes? But certainly we need labeling for content. But it has to be credible labeling. It has to be based on scientific evidence. You can't put a label on something scaring people away for reasons that cannot be justified with the existing evidence. And that would, for example, mean that if you were to label something containing GMOs, you would have to, because it's unhealthy for you, have to have some evidence to show that in fact it is unhealthy for you. We need to maintain food safety standards. But I added this, suitable for the intended consumers, because the food safety standards that I want in Denmark may be quite different from the food safety standards that the African consumer may wish to have. Why is that? Am I arguing for double standards or dual standards or poor people eating dirty food, as I've been accused of? No, I'm not. I'm saying, look, if by increasing your level of food safety, you are increasing the price of the food, there is a point beyond which additional improvement in food safety will do very little for your food, for your health. But it will do a lot for your access to food, because it's going to be more and more expensive. I think we call that something like diminishing return. Whereas in Denmark, I can afford to try to reach nirvana, meaning food that's completely safe. You can't ever quite get there unless you start putting it in your mouth. But you can get close. But it's going to be very expensive as you move that up. Now, this is exactly what the European Union is doing. They keep pushing that food safety standard up, and developing countries do not have to follow that if it means that the food is going to be much more expensive, because it may be extremely safe, but you can't afford it. And I've written a couple of articles on that in case anybody wants to follow up. Regulation of food advertising. We have a case study done on food advertising for children in the United States. Very, very interesting case. Should the government enter in? Is this where the government should enter in and say, there are certain restrictions on what you can advertise on television, say Saturday morning, which I guess is when a lot of children are watching television. Maybe they watch television all day. But so, what is the government's role in regulating food advertisement? Health-focused social marketing campaigns, and we need to improve cold chains for perishable food. The health-focused social marketing campaigns, again, would be a way of countering some of the information that comes from private corporations to buy stuff that society doesn't think is good for you. And I'm almost done. This is my last, next to last slide. Health and nutrition education. I talked about the behavioral issues. I don't need to go into that again. We need to strengthen the gender equality in consumption allocation decisions. I've talked about that in other contexts. We need to reduce the burden on women's time. I talked about that. and we need to create and implement food and health safety nets. And this is my last slide. Empower women in households and community decision making. That gender specificity keeps coming up in study after study. And just so that you men don't think this is a conspiracy theory, these studies, most of them are made by men, so it's not that the women are ganging up on us, at least I don't think so. Improve sanitation, drinking water, and enhance access to primary health care. And I thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you. My name is Eran Bendavid. I'm an assistant professor of medicine here at Stanford. I want to thank Wally and Ross for inviting me to discuss Per's paper, and also for setting me up for trying to follow such a wonderful and eye-opening discussion. Professor Pinstrup-Andersen's breadth of knowledge and experience in the field of food policy is remarkable, and his achievements spread thin could probably make the parents of an entire Stanford class quite proud. Few people have thought as deeply about food systems and how they do or do not achieve their goals. Per's thesis addresses the relationship between food and health and nutrition, with a particular emphasis on the African context, and also on the global threat of undernutrition, malnutrition, and obesity. We heard about the gap between the stated importance of nutrition and health in the justification of food system activities and their revealed preferences of actual policies, while the alleviation of hunger and malnutrition is frequently used in the justifying the design of food system policies. The pathways from policies to improve nutrition is often vague and incompletely understood. We heard a pretty dizzying exposition of the complex dynamics of food systems and their interaction with health and nutrition through economic, social, demographic, and environmental forces. Much of what we heard serves to illustrate the poor alignment of food systems with adequate nutrition and health, and the potential contribution of such poorly aligned systems to the burden of poor nutrition and other health outcomes. Pears also makes the point that despite the thin evidence, the design of future policy that is better aligned with health and nutrition goals is possible through careful understanding of the complex dynamics of food systems. For example, we heard about the control of human interactions with livestock, or the enhancement of gender-specific productivity as potential policies. I would like to expand on a few points that Per made. My hope is to highlight some areas with lingering questions that can be further addressed in the discussion. I'm a physician, and when you give a kid a hammer, everything looks like a nail, so I'll start from the medical and biological perspective. The first point I would like to make is expand on is on the complex link between nutrition and health. The terms nutrition and health often come out in the same breath, and they are intimately related, but they're not the same. To say that my sort of nutritional status is adequate means that all the component parts that make me up, including my human and non-human cells, are getting the necessary materials to sustain the biological activities of life. My brain cells are getting glucose so that my neurons can fire to make barely intelligible arguments. My muscle cells are getting protein to allow me to escape the bicycle stampede on Sarah Mall, and every cell in my body is getting enough building blocks to repair the damage of watching the vice presidential debates. Adequate nourishment may be necessary, but it's not sufficient for being healthy. For example, the global burden of cancer, heart disease, and lung diseases is rising even in populations with a perfectly fine nutritional status. In a sense, nutrition sits between food and health, and my question is whether policies can target both at the same time, and we can talk about more of that later. But that brings me to another point related to the complexity of the interaction between nutrition and health. Robert Fogel, the Nobel Prize-winning economic historian, argues that perhaps the single most important factor contributing to the rising human longevity over the past couple of centuries is more and better food. Now, more food may lead to longer life despite sort of nutritional compromises. And here's an example. A critical mechanism by which foodstuffs we put in our mouths is then churned into longer and healthier life involves the human immunity and the resilience that comes with a well-tuned system. When healthy, we don't usually pay it much attention. But every single moment of every single day, it works to isolate and destroy threatening viruses, bacteria, and fungi. For example, we don't think of the common bread mold as a major health risk, but people with a weakened immune system, think of people with HIV or chemotherapy, commonly get overwhelming bread mold infections. Vaccination as well, perhaps the most important life-saving innovation of all time, work through the immune system as well. But here's what I want to say about the immune system. It is a highly adaptive and flexible system with enormous nutritional and energy requirements. And there's not clear evidence to suggest where where it stops improving well into the zone that we associate with food overconsumption and health risks such as obesity and diabetes. When Fogel did his historical analysis, he estimated that mortality is lowest at BMI, body mass index, around 23. By most definitions, ideal BMI, at least when it comes to mortality, is between 20 and 25, while underweight or malnourished is below 20, overweight is 25 to 30, and obesity is upwards of 30. But whether slim is really better is now being challenged. Historically, plump was considered healthy. My grandmother used to worry about what a skinny little boy I was. Not that I'm a leviathan now, except in the eyes of my 5-year-old, but now lean is in, and I don't think even my grandmother would try to stuff me with chopped liver anymore. Well, the epidemiological evidence now suggests that the bottom of the U-shaped BMI and mortality curve is creeping up, and people with a BMI of 26 or 27 have the lowest mortality in many populations. And human longevity also continues to creep up despite and alongside our collectively increasing caloric consumption and waist size. So as we consider Professor Pinstrup-Andersen's important ideas about threading the needle of food policy to promote health while balancing malnutrition and obesity, this link between nutrition and health calls for more answers. I hear there's a reception following this seminar, and I propose some primary research on this topic. And this is a good segue to another important point raised by Per, the evidence gap. Per brings up an important points about the limitations of small-scale evaluations and the dearth of large-scale evaluations. In the medical world, for better or worse, randomized trials are at the top of the evidence hierarchy. But randomized controlled trials are no longer the sole property of medicine. And over the past few years, their use has exploded in such diverse areas as education, microfinance, democratic voter participation, and health insurance. The Mexican government subjected their entire expanded national health insurance program for the poor, Seguro Popular, to a randomized evaluation. These trials are complex, lengthy, and costly. But the larger the program, the greater the value that comes from having evidence to guide policy. In the development, health, and education world, the initial trials were largely serendipitous. The confluence of a skilled investigator, a program that was about to be implemented, and decision makers with the foresight and vision to see the value of rigorous evaluation. Randomized assignment of textbooks to Kenyan children was used to evaluate the effects of giving textbooks to test scores. Randomized treatment of intestinal worms in rural Kenya was used to test the effects on rates of anemia and school achievement. Such small but solid empirical foundations expanded the frontier of what was known and then led to a daisy chain of experiments that dramatically altered the process and content of policy design. And this brings me to the last issue. Per makes many excellent policy suggestions that could improve health and nutrition, especially in Africa, where too little food remains the dominant form of the food security issue. These policy suggestions include up-the-food chain interventions such as infrastructure improvements, community-level interventions such as social marketing, and person-level interventions such as empowerment of women and young girls. An important question, however, is how to implement these policies. In the health domain, policies aiming to directly improve the health in Africa often face serious implementation challenges and have unforeseen and unintended consequences. In my area of expertise, HIV policy, some of the most ardent criticisms have been leveled at the best of intentions. Support for the control of HIV is said to crowd out other health priorities and funnel healthcare workers and resources away from the public health system towards better paying aid-supported and aid-financed priorities. I'm not a food policy expert, but it seems to me that well-designed food policies in any country or community will need to work with local institutions. A complicated task, even where governance systems are relatively transparent and functional. Here again, I would ask whether rigorous evidence and trials have a role to play not in the content, but in the advocacy for policy implementation. With all the skepticism over the veracity of the scientific endeavor, good evidence and new knowledge has a way of changing our world bit by bit. So any graduate students out there with a need for their next PhD project, consider this a call to action. Preserving and improving the human health and nutrition should be real goals of well-designed food systems. This is particularly true for improving under and malnutrition, especially in Africa. But when it comes to human health, we don't fully understand how food systems work their way under the skin. Real trials to eliminate such policy areas can provide knowledge and the impetus for future change. I will end here, but not before thanking Per for once more for coming to Stanford and for his long-standing leadership and commitment to improving health and well-being of the world's poor. Many thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Per and Eran. It was a wonderful talk and terrific points that you made, Eran, that I want to pick up on. What we'll do, we have about 35 minutes for questions at this point, and I will start with one question, but you can think of your question. I tend to favor students first, but I want you to keep your questions short and to the point, so we have plenty of time for everyone to ask questions. But Eran, I just wanted to pick up on the point that you raised there at the end in terms of the implementation and give Per a chance to actually answer that question. There was a lot of suggestions that were made towards the end of the talk, and implementing these is very difficult. So Per, I was wondering if you could just say a few words about the difficulties in implementing, why health and nutrition and food haven't come together in policy and in development programs as well as we might hope, and what might be some of the ways we might overcome those barriers.
Sure, I'd be glad to. The incentives are against multidisciplinary problem-solving activities, whether it's in government, in academia, or for that matter, anywhere else in the economy. The economy tends to, whether it's the American economy, the Danish economy, or an African economy, tend to be set up around silos. And you're loyal to your silo. And the silo can be a Ministry of Health, it can be a Ministry of Agriculture, Nutrition. It doesn't have its own silo, so it's not clear exactly where it ends up in the various countries. Sometimes the president decides to have a high-level nutrition committee that meets once a month and doesn't really do much of anything. But the point is that there are really no incentives for somebody working in the Ministry of Health to reach over into the Ministry of Agriculture or to some health group or to academia to develop a multidisciplinary solution to the problem. You find that at the local level, in many African countries, at the local level, it is so obvious to the people who are sent out by the various ministries, the extension agents, whatever the title may be. It's so obvious to them that if the problems are to be solved, they have to work together. But at the capital cities, it is much less obvious. In academia, it's a very similar problem. If I want to get tenure, I'm a young assistant professor, I want to get tenure in economics, I'm not going to do multidisciplinary research and publish it in some journal that is taking multidisciplinary manuscripts. For one thing, that journal is probably obscure. It's not well known because it's not part of the setup. So I'm going to focus on economics, and the same in the other disciplines. So whether you're in academia or in government or in consulting firms or wherever you may be, the structure of the setup is such that there's no real incentive. Now, how do we deal with that? We deal with that, of course, by changing the incentives. That's how you get around to it. You change the incentives and you provide incentives for working across disciplines. Do I know how to do that? No. If I knew how to do that, I would be out there doing it. But I think if we can agree that that's what we need to do, then people that are a whole lot smarter than me can probably figure out how to do it. But we haven't even agreed how to do that. It's a serious problem.
Great. Questions, anybody? Yes, in the back, and can you just introduce yourself briefly when you ask the question?
Thank you very much for an insightful talk. My name is John. I just graduated from Stanford, actually, and I'm now working for a food-related company. So I came here as a general audience. And my question is very much related to my own behavior after hearing this global talk. I very much believe in your talk about behavioral change of individuals is the ultimate thing that can change the system. And I'm wondering, as an individual living in the United States, what can I do in terms of my daily behavior to have a positive change or positive impact to this system?
Are you thinking of how can you influence the well-being of people in Africa? Was that what you were thinking?
No, about changing my behavior, for example, what I buy as a food. I believe that what I buy make a difference to people in Africa.
Well, for one thing, you should read the labels and make sure that the labels are actually based on solid evidence. When I go to the supermarket, which I don't do very much, but when I do, I actually read the label. My wife reads the labels as well. That seems to me is the first step. But if you're thinking of changing your behavior for your own well-being, for your own health, there is a tremendous amount of information available. And again, as I said, labeling is one of the ways you can get that information, but there's so much information available. The problem with some of that information, I'm not a nutritionist, so I should be real careful, but the nutritionists tend to send out very different messages, and it's sometimes extremely difficult to understand what the nutrition community is really recommending, because it depends on who you talk to. So one of the things that nutritionists need to work on is to come together around at least some basic messages that are unlikely to be changed within the next few days.
Ron, do you want to add anything?
Well, it used to be in the sort of there was something people used to say in the business world that what is good for business is good for society, and we can sometimes think of it as actually it should be the other way around. What is good for society is good for business, so collectively changing individual behaviors, should eventually change the way that sort of businesses are sort of thinking about their own goals. And so, in that sense, certainly individual behaviors can change. The question a little bit is, I think, as Per alluded to, is how to know what is sort of good, either for your own individual behavior or collectively as a community.
Can I just add to that? One of the very interesting debates that's going on in where I go is, does the consumer decide what is being produced, or does the producer decide what's being consumed? And since you're working in a private corporation, I can ask you the question, do you produce what you think the consumer would really like, or do you try to convince the consumer to consume what you want to produce? And there's no unique answer as far as I know. Nobody has figured out the right answer to that. Presumably it's a combination of the two, but it's an outstanding debate as to what is really the power of the consumer relative to what is being produced in the supply chain.
Jeff Kosef, I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering. And thank you for this excellent talk, and Eran as well for your excellent follow-up. One of the things that came out most strongly, I think, Per, out of your talk is that things aren't always what they seem, and there's a lot of nuance and subtleties in a lot of these issues. So I'd like to, with all due respect to my colleague Jenna Davis, just sort of refer to her work when we talk about access. And you talked about access to water and access to food, and I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about what exactly you mean by access and how you define it. I think what Jen has shown very clearly in her work in Africa is that by the Millennium Development Goals, people might be meeting the definition of access to fresh water, but certainly in their behavior and in terms of what they have to do to gain access, fetching distance and walking distance is incredibly important. So they're just simply not getting the kind of water that MDG thinks they're getting because of behavioral issues. So is there a parallel perhaps when it comes to access to food, and that's a subtlety perhaps that needs to be looked at as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is a parallel, and that's why I put income and time constraints in between food availability and availability on water and sanitation and so on, and access. I think one of the issues that we really have to make sure that's understood by the policymakers is that time is not a free good. If a woman has to walk 20 kilometers or 20 miles or whatever to get water, that's costly. That's a real cost to her. She doesn't really have that time because that would mean giving up on something else, which could be whatever it is, breastfeeding or whatever. So the time constraints are very important. That's why access, in my opinion, is when the household has the option of obtaining, whether it's food or water or sanitation. But if there is no clean water in the community, there is no access. So it's not available. If the water is 20 miles away and she really cannot find the time to go and get it, it's so expensive to find that time from somewhere else, then it's not accessible. So access is what the household could, if it wanted, obtain. Now, where behavior then comes in and say, all right, sure, so I have access to this food if I give up everything else. If I give up school fees, if I give up whatever else I'm spending money on or putting time into, I could get access to it. And this is the problem I have with food security as a measurement, as a concept, as an indicator, if you like. That just because a household is food secure doesn't mean that it actually utilizes that food security, if you see what I'm saying. Yes, it's accessible if you give up the other things, but so is any of the other things if you give up food security. So it's a very slippery concept. I don't like it. It's good for promotional purposes, but don't go to the sausage factory. Just eat the sausage and be happy.
Stephen?
David Lobel from FSC. Thank you both for the talks. Perry, you touched on a few times the link between diet diversity and nutrition, and how in developing countries the research agenda may drive a sort of a move away from diet diversity, or at least a slowing of the transition to diet diversity. So my question is, I guess the counter argument I've heard, which I hang around with a lot of people who work on cereal, so this is a counter argument from that crowd, is that not all diet diversity is equal, and in particular, what really helps improve nutrition is consumption of meat products, and the consumption of meat products is tightly linked to, the price of calories and cheap grains. So I just wanted to give you a chance to either specifically address that argument, or just talking maybe more specifics about what type of diet diversities we should be valuing most, and what that implies for the research policies in these countries.
Well, a small piece of meat is a good thing because it has iron in it, and it's good for both kids and adults. So it's a matter of balancing. Having a huge steak every hour on the hour is a bad thing, but having it's a matter of how much, and that's why it's so difficult to legislate against dietary changes. It's very easy to say stop smoking because it doesn't really have any positive effect as far as anybody knows. But meat does have a positive effect as long as it's eaten in moderation. No, you don't need it. You can be a vegetarian and take some B12 pills and you'll be okay. But so it's very difficult to legislate against something that a certain amount is good, but too much of it's not. What are you going to do? Are you going to say, if I see you at McDonald's every morning for breakfast, I'm going to penalize you. But if you only go once a week, it's okay. You can't really legislate against that. Now, the kind of diet diversity that we shouldn't have is the kind of diet diversity that frequently comes with globalization, trade liberalization of small, low-income countries, where suddenly they have access to a huge number of processed foods, most of which are high in refined added sugar and sweetener and high in fat. That increases diet diversity, but is in the wrong direction. So the diet diversity that I think we need is the kind that comes, for example, by taking another look at orphan crops in Africa. Orphan crops are the crops that nobody, as the term implies, they are orphans. Nobody cared about them. There's been very little research done on those crops. We haven't really understood how much productivity increase would be possible for those crops. But if, there's a long list of those crops, that if productivity could be increased of those crops and they could be maintained on the small farms, that could dramatically improve the diet diversity for the benefit of micronutrient consumption. And that's really what the diet diversity is about. It's about having a balanced intake of the nutrients. And if you don't have a diverse diet, you're not likely to get that unless you pop a multivitamin pill, which of course poor people in Africa may not be able to do. So that's the kind of diet diversity I'm looking for. It's a tough one because the researchers are used to working on one crop at a time, and we're going to try to deal with that crop and get rid of we try to introduce resistance to all the diseases and the pests and so on. We're going to increase productivity. We'll deal with this crop here, and we'll deal with the other crop over there. Doing research on mixed cropping or a diversified production system is extremely difficult. And I know I was arguing for this when I was chairman of the Science Council, and I didn't get very far.
I work for a nonprofit called Heifer International, and you make so many great points about food security and just all across the board. But we work with smallholder farmers in different countries around the world, and work on all sorts of areas with food security for families and communities and all that area, income management. What you talked about with women is so important. But my question is on a different matter, and do you think, based upon what you're saying with the levels of population that we're going to be having, that population control should be in the mix of food policy and food security, and if so, how? Because it also has an effect, Eran, on infectious diseases as well. So what are your thoughts on population control, both developing and our countries like ours?
I don't like the term population control because it implies that somebody is controlling your population, but I do firmly believe, and it's, I didn't talk about it today, but it's in much of what I've written, that women, for that matter, and men should have access to reproductive health care. It's very clear. It's very clearly part of the long-term solution to the food security problem. There's no question about that. Reproductive health care has to be a very important component of that. It's very disappointing that the US government, from time to time, depending on who is in power, cuts off funding for these kinds of things. And I'm not going to go into the abortion debate, so let's just talk about reproductive health care. For the purpose of helping families have the number of children they want, not for the government to tell them how many they can have. China tried that. It was very successful, but it was very painful. Most women in Africa, as far as the studies go, would like smaller families. But for all kinds of reasons, including some of the gender-specific decision-making in the household and so on, they can't. They have more children than they want. So reproductive health care available to families so they can decide how many children they want, absolutely. I think that is very much part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Sort of demographic change is part of, the growth of the population is one of the big challenges. Now, if you sort of break down where the trends are heading, really Africa is the main place where there's still sort of really dramatic growth and expected to be dramatic growth. And so, there's no doubt that, insofar as that's where the confluence of poverty, high burden of disease, and high population growth, there's sort of sort of three areas that are very closely interacting with each other, and all of them sort of in a sort of geographically confined area. And so without a doubt, how to do that. I think ideally one would want to help people get what they really want, right? And so through various ways of introducing. I don't necessarily like the word access, but access to reproductive health and access to the ability to sort of control one's family size is certainly part of the key.
Let me pop in here too, because I think that women's education is really important as well. And I'll let you go first, Per, but I wanted to just ask you a bigger question, and maybe Eran can answer this. The connection between the type of nutrition you have and your cognitive ability to actually be able to learn and to be able to benefit from schooling in a way that actually progresses a community to the stage where they would have fewer kids, where they would have more income, where they would have better health care within the home. So I think that one of the questions is education, but that connection between food and cognitive ability, can you address that at all? Eran, as the medical expert here.
So, there are many pathways through which we know this happens, right? So, chronic anemia, growth stunting, various ways in which sort of either some general low-calorie or micronutrient deficiency all can sort of lead to these conditions. All of these hamper people's educational attainment. And so, when you treat anemia either by iron fortification, worming, deworming exercises, these are all ways in which people have sort of shown that you can dramatically improve people's educational attainment, and that later on translates to higher labor participation, smaller families, again, sort of all these good things. And so, we also know more and more that influences on people's health very early in their life have huge downstream influences on what they are when they grow up. And so, for all these reasons, I think both education and also sort of early life opportunity and intervention are central.
Can I just add to that I don't think either of us have mentioned that the first 1,000 days after conception is the period when the nutrition insult is unlikely to be repaired afterwards. That's the most critical period of time. That's during pregnancy and the first 2 years of a child's life. And one of the arguments is, what can the food system do to help with avoiding a nutrition insult during that period of time? And there's quite a bit that the food system can do. It's in the paper, but one is related to women's time, but another one is to produce the kind of food that's needed for supplementation or for therapeutic foods if the child is already malnourished. But Ross, let me totally agree with you on the education side, but also poverty. As people are able to escape poverty, they want smaller families. That has been shown time and time again.
Way in the back.
My name is Kate Dreyer, and I'm at the Carnegie Institution for Science, and I wanted to thank both of the speakers for their wonderful presentations. And I was particularly struck by the comment that time constraints for women are often a serious impediment to, for example, getting adequate nutrition. And I was wondering, what are some of the policy implications of that? Are there specific policies for removing that constraint for women? It sounds like in some cases it might be putting a well in a town, but for the Bolivian goat herder, how do you give women more time?
Well, there are a number of ways. One, of course, it depends on whether you're in an urban area or rural area. If you're in an urban area, it's a matter of child care facilities. It's a matter of having facilities for breastfeeding during working hours. There are a number of things like that. If you're more in a rural area, or for that matter, rural or urban, it's a question of increasing productivity of the activities that the women are going to continue to do. But that's no big surprise. I mean, this is exactly what we did in the United States and Denmark and many other high-income countries. We did exactly that. We said, yes, we want women to have an opportunity to work outside the home, and in order for that to happen, we've got to help them increase productivity in what they do at home. sharing with the husband is another option, of course. But in many of the cases we're talking about, the husbands are working somewhere else, trying to earn some money. They're really not there on the farm during the week. So there may be limited possibilities for sharing. But improving the productivity, and that means things like getting access to water without having to walk 20 kilometers or 20 miles. It gets access to primary health care. What we're telling those poor women is to take their 2 or 3 or 4 children, walk 30 miles to the health clinic once a month, and then after they've done that, they get some food to take home. So they're carrying 2 kids. 2 kids are walking behind them, and then they're carrying 40 pounds of food. Come on. We're doing that. Those are development projects, by the way. There is a lot that can be done to improve productivity of poor women, but it has not been a priority.
Adam in the back there? Or Jeff, did you have a?
Wally does.
Okay, Wally and then Adam. Since Wally's got the microphone.
Wally Falcon from Food Security.
It's not on.
Yes,
It is.
This series deals with India as well as Africa. And I want to ask you, Per, about your take on some of the Indian data that I find extremely troublesome. It concerns children up to age 5, where the increased production, decreased poverty still hasn't affected very much the levels of stunting and wasting. I think that question is huge because it's such a large country. And I wonder if you can tell us more about why you think that problem still is so strong and powerful in India.
The short answer is no, I can't. It's a debate that's been going on now for quite some time, and there are a number of hypotheses. In fact, yesterday we had a seminar presentation at Cornell by a person who has studied that at great length, an Indian economist. His main conclusion was that 2 basically. 1, it's a puzzle, which we knew, and 2, it has a lot to do with women's status in India. Was his conclusion. It is a puzzle that as Indian economic growth has picked up, not so much the most recent, but a period of time when it had a high economic growth, child malnutrition did not really improve. Child nutrition did not really improve. There have been all kinds of other hypotheses, as you know. One is it's a wrong measure that we're using. In fact, Indian children are supposed to be smaller and shorter and lightweight and so on. So don't worry, your pretty little head, this is fine. I don't buy that argument, but that's another hypothesis that's been put forward. The Indian grain market is in complete disarray. They now got 50 million tons of grain in stock, of which probably 1/3 to 1/2 is outside in the weather, rotting away, while people don't have enough to eat. They cannot get their food distribution system to work. And I've talked to a number of Indians, some in fairly high positions, trying to understand what's going on. And the argument I get is, look, the public distribution system, which we do have, is so corrupt that anytime we send grain through that system, it's going to end up in the wrong stomachs. So there's no point sending more grain through that system. So they are at a complete loss. They have then decided they're going to have an electronic card, like a credit card type thing, like we have for SNAP, for the food stamp program in this country, where each and every Indian below a certain cutoff point will have one of those cards, and there'll be allocated money to that card every month, and then they can go and they can get free food up to a certain quantity depending on the farm, on the household size and so on. My answer to that was, it would be a miracle if it works, and the miracle hasn't happened yet. They're trying, they tested it out, but they're really trying to find out how they can deal with this problem. That's the food distribution problem, but the other part of the puzzle is, why is that income growth not reaching the rural areas? And it doesn't seem to be. And I suppose one answer could be because the government didn't prioritize rural areas, but I'm not sure that's a good answer either, because, for example, they get high subsidies for a number of things. They get very high prices for the food grain. That's why they end up with 80 million tons in stock, because they're buying it at prices that are above the market price. They get high subsidies for electricity, for irrigation, and so on. So and that may go to the larger farmers. So no, my answer to you is I'm as confused as the next guy. Do you have an answer?
No, that's why I asked you.
Yeah.
But it was a good compliment to the lecture on India we had as part of the symposium, I think, in terms of why it's not reaching the rural areas, more service-based in very low-value services instead of manufacturing and other things that lead to growth. So it's great. We'll have time for one more question, since I promised Adam in the back there, if you still have your question. And then we'll move on to the reception.
So yeah, my name's Adam Sibley, and I'm a research assistant in FSE. And my question has to do with the several anecdotes that Per brought up in his talk about people's lifestyles that are fairly full of stress, both to their body and to their spirit, and how you can reconcile that with your comment that people are not making rationally based decisions in terms of their decisions about their own nutrition. I believe that a nutritional decision is kind of based on long-term expected outcomes, whereas if your life is fairly full of stress, you don't, or maybe not operating logically on that time scale, but maybe acting perfectly logically on the time scale that you're forced to consider, which is the day-to-day. And I ask because I think this is an important thing that needs to be reconciled when you model someone's decisions, the decisions we want them to make, so that they have better nutrition with the type of decision-making framework that they're going to be implementing.
Let me clarify that I did not say, and I do not believe, that they are making irrational decisions. I'm saying there's a new literature now that argues that many of the decisions that are being made are not being made on the premise that they want the best outcome for them per effort spent. No, it's that they're not rational in the utilitarian sense. I was not in any sense suggesting that poor people react to that. In fact, I'm questioning that. I agree with Wally when he made the point earlier today that maybe this wasn't really the case. So I'm certainly not saying that. Quite the opposite. What I'm saying is that we from outside frequently think that we know what the intended beneficiaries should be doing, whether we are in government or we in academia. And when they don't do as we think they should do, we call them irrational. And I think that is irrational. They have their own agendas, exactly as you, I'm just agreeing with you 100%. They have their own constraints, their own agendas they have to deal with, and we don't fully understand those. So I completely agree with where you come out, but I disagree with the characterization of what you think I said, because that was not what I said. Let me make one other point on the trickling down in India. We have a similar problem in some of the African countries that Eran mentioned that have been growing fast recently. Much of the growth has come from the mining sector in those countries, and that money is not trickling down to poor people either. And you can look at countries like, well, let's take Mozambique, let's take Kenya. There are 3 or 4 countries where poverty is going up almost as fast as economic growth. In other words, you would think that poverty would go down. So the trickling down, I never believed much in trickling down. I much prefer trickling up, but that's a different story. Let's not get too close to the election here, the presidential election. But in many of the African countries that now show these 6 to 8 to 10% annual growth rates, that money tends not to end up with the poor.
Well, I think because we do have a reception and we will be eating food and having drink, we'll just thank both of you very, very much for great presentations and interesting discussion. And please stay, enjoy the reception, and continue to talk to the speakers out in the reception. Thank you very much.